we move on to Professor Sri Kalyan ji, Halley Kalyan ji. Halley Kalyan ji is going to speak on how Jaati Puranas sacralize the traditional occupations of the various Jaatis.
Hello everyone, and welcome to this symposium on Jaati Puranas by Indic Academy, and thanks for taking time out on a Sunday morning for this. So let me give a brief introduction before I go deep into this. So as Professor Nagaraj Paturi Garu has mentioned, I work in the corporate industry, so I'm not somebody who is like a scholar or an academic doing field research on these topics. But what draws me into this is that I see myself as an enthusiast who is trying to discover and understand Sanatan Dharma. And I've discovered this world of Jati Puranas a few years ago. As a few of the other speakers have mentioned already, it is impossible to get a complete picture of the workings of Indian culture without having a very fundamental and solid understanding of Jatis. And Jati Puranas have a role to play there because they help in understanding how each Jati saw itself in the whole Hindu pantheon and what roles the Jati Puranas played there. And that's really what draws me into this particular topic. And as I discovered this particular topic on Jati Puranas, I've also kept wondering, why is it that this as a topic, why is it that this isn't as mainstreamed as a lot of other narratives on Jati is in our own curriculums, in our own popular conception of Hinduism and Hindu culture. So I've learned from the works of a lot of professors and scholars in the domain, professors like Professor Pulikonda Subbachari, who has done work on Jati Puranas, and another speaker today on the panel, Sumarspati Reddy Garu. He has a channel where some of the work of tribals and Jatis in Adilabad are uploaded. So there is a list of interviews with somebody called Ravinder Sharma Garu, who used to run an ashram in Hyderabad called the Kala Ashram, where a lot of these jatis came together and they tried to preserve and nurture those cultures. So as an outsider, I kind of learn from all of these work done by so many scholars and academics. So let me begin by citing the work of an academic from the 20th century, A.M. Hocart, who was an anthropologist who has done a lot of good work on the topic of caste, and he wrote in English, so he uses the word caste. So he looked at caste and caste as a unit, and he tried to compare it across cultures. So he makes this point specifically in the point when he's referring to Jati Puranas and the whole ritual universe of Jatis. So he says this, that to a European, the barber is just a man who shaves. The washerman is somebody who does the laundry. But for a native, these two mean much more than that. Now, funnily enough, a lot of us today think like the European because we have lost a connect, because a lot of us, let's say people of my age and are younger than me, they've all been brought up in a kind of urban modernizing India. And we look at a barber the way Hocart here is saying that how a European looks at a barber, or how a European looks at a washerman. It's a very transactional and economic kind of a perspective that we have, and we don't participate in a kind of ritual universe where a barber or a washerman do lot many more functions as compared to being somebody who is just doing the laundry or being somebody who is just doing shaving as a function. So if you look at how in the traditional community these particular jatis participated, you'd see that they had a role to play in marriages, they had a role to play in various family functions, they had a role to play in funerals. And in fact, Hocart, when he's talking about barbers, he also mentions of how they become priests in cremation ground for some specific jatis. So that's a very different view of looking at these jatis, where every jati was like in a world in itself. They had their professional role to perform. They also became priests for some jatis, and they also had ritual roles in various life cycle or family functions around marriages, around deaths, around newborns, and things like that. And these origin myths or the Jati Puranas that a lot of these Jatis use to communicate and to convey their role, meaning, and identity in the world. If you look at the composure of those origin myths, you'd see that in these Jati Puranas, a lot of the backstory for why a particular Jati is performing a particular function that is kind of crystallized and propagated over time. Now, again, when we look at these, today we tend to rationalize all these customs. We try to apply some kind of a very rational, logical perspective, and we look at everybody as an economic entity. And somebody like Hokart says that you are actually excluding this far older and more widespread type of man who is a religious man. So we try to look at everybody as an economic man, and that's why we have a hard time of trying to place or understand some of these myths. And when you look at this, the conception of this universe, where every occupation was some sort of a priesthood, we are at odds with that sort of a conception. And that is why an understanding of Jati Puranas becomes extremely important for us today, if we are to understand who we are, what is our culture, and how our own cultural artifacts expose these cultural norms, so on. Now, uh, well, as I mentioned, there is also this aspect of hereditary succession and things like that when we are referring to Jati Puranas and Jatis in general. Of course, today in our world, hereditary professional succession is no more the norm. So that is another piece of disconnect we have when we look at Jatis, because the identity is getting carried forward, but the professions are not, because the world has changed, of course, after the Industrial Revolution, so on. But then as a culture, there is a lot of things that we still inherit. So what we practice in terms of rituals, what we practice in terms of our own pujas and things like that, that is something we still continue to inherit. And that inheritance changes from person to person, because everybody belongs to a particular family, and that family in turn belongs to a particular jati, so on. So as Professor Subhachari mentioned earlier, that Jaatis are not going away. They continue to stay in our composite universe today, be it in terms as politics or in terms of identifying as under one particular group identity, or anything like that. They continue to remain. Now, let me also cite another very important line from somebody whom I respect a lot. This is from Dharampal ji, who was a Gandhian historian who had done a lot of work based on British archives in trying to construct and understand and the times or how India was just before the British came, or just about the time when the British came. So he refers to a particular letter that Warren Hastings has written, or it's something that he has documented, where a particular jati, which today is classified under Dalits in South India, that jati, when they were introducing themselves to the British officials, so they actually said something like this, which is that we are great soldiers, we also make sandals, which is to say that they perform multiple roles, that they make sandals, which is they do leather work, but they're also great soldiers. And in this context, Dharampalji says that that is the self-image of that particular jati. Now, today you might be categorizing that jati as Dalits or as scheduled castes or whatever, but what is the self-image of that jati as per their own lore? And it is in understanding that self-image of each individual jatis that is where Jati Puranas have a very, very important role to play, because it is these jatis themselves that are talking about themselves and nurturing this over centuries. And that's why understanding Jati Puranas is of a great importance for us today. Otherwise, we fall prey to let's say applying the Marxist lens of thinking that X Jati was an exploiter and Y Jati is an exploited, and putting everything in a strict hierarchy, and trying to imagine our own culture based on these categories of exploiter, exploited, and the usual Marxist narrative. I think Jati Puranas help in kind of broad basing all of this, because as earlier speaker also mentioned, that every Jati considered itself sacred, its job sacred, and its role sacred. And they didn't have this kind of an inferiority complex that they carried forward through generations. And in their own self-image, every jati considered itself as superior as an identity of its own. They were not ashamed of their identities, and neither did they carry any guilt. So in that context, it is very important to understand Jati Puranas. So through this talk, I'd like to focus on two aspects. One is that of how Jati Puranas sacralized work, which is essentially sacralizing the mundane routine activities that happen, and also the interrelationships between Jatis, which got crystallized through this institution of Jati Puranas. So let me take an example, the example which Professor Supachari also cited in passing, which is that of Adapolu. So Adapolu is a particular Ashrita Kulam or a Jati which is dependent on the Jati of what is colloquially called here as Nai Brahmins, who are the Barbar Jati. So you have the Nais who become the patron Jatis for Adapolu, and Adapolu in turn narrate the story of the Barbar caste and their whole universe. So in this particular Puranas that the Adapolu narrate, you can see this whole interplay of sacralizing work and sacralizing the mundane play out very beautifully, because in the Purana of Adapolu, they actually like every other Jati Purana, they get into the inner workings of what a barbar does, or what let's say to use a politically correct term, what beauticians do. So the Adapolu actually narrate the story of how the instruments came to be. So they have the story of how the scissors, the razor, the blade, um, the stone that a barber uses to sharpen his knives, the comb, and various other all these artifacts, how those came to be. And in this process, if you look at these Puranas, they go back to the Kalyanam of Shiva and Parvati. So it is to reduce it for the sake of this particular context. It is something like this. It is like when gods are getting married, even gods need beauticians, and even gods need somebody to get them ready for their marriage. And it is in that sort of a narrative that the Adapolu kind of plays the work of Nai Brahmins or barbers to say that even for Shiva Parvati Kalyanam, they needed certain functions to be performed. And that's how barbers came to be. And then over time, if you look at how that evolved, every time a marriage happens, or every time any other function happens in households, uh, barbers have like a very specific designated role, and the women in the barber caste also have a very designated role. Let's say when a birth happens in a family, or around menstruation and things like that. So all of these roles are getting sanctified and sacralized with these Puranas that the Adapolu narrate for the barbers. Now, of course, things are changing, as Professor Subachari mentioned, that not many of these Adapolu today remain to narrate these stories. And the caste composure of, let's say, the people who function who perform the function of barbers, even that may have changed, and a lot of things are happening today. But then it is important to understand this, because it is a way in which a particular function has been sacralized. Now, immaterial of whether it is something that is hereditary succession today or not, the fact is that that particular function continues to be performed today, but it has become just a mundane routine activity, and there is no sacred element around it, in that there is nobody present to sacralize that activity. And today, as people who use that particular function of barbers today, we also treat it as something which is merely transactional, and we don't look at it as something sacred as well. So in some sense, we have become like what I mentioned at the start of my talk, that we have become like Europeans today, who look at barber as somebody who just shaves. There is nothing else. The other constituent elements which were part of our society before, they don't exist anymore, because we have in some sense desacralized these works and desacralize these communities. And the communities that were doing the act of sacralizing these particular functions, they don't exist anymore, because of the whole journey of colonialism and modernity that we went through in the past few decades. So I think that is something very important for us to think today, as we try to introspect and understand who we are and what our culture is. Now, similarly, there is another Jati called Pekarlu, who perform this kind of a Purana narrative function for Kumaris, who are potters. And if you look at their Puranas and how they have sacralized that work of a potter, you'd see that you have the potter's wheel, which is something a lot of us are familiar of, even though we may not see it on our day-to-day today in cities, let's say, but in ritual purposes, they continue to be used. So you have the potter's wheel, and then the instrument that the potter uses to make the pots. And if you see how the Pekkarlu narrate their Puranam, the Kumari Puranam, this evolution of potter's wheel and this sacralizing of the job of potter, you'll see Brahma come in here, you'll see Vishnu come in here, you'll see Shiva come in here, and you'll see Indra as well. So through the means of all these gods, and you'll see how the work of potter got sacralized, and how each of those instruments, they kind of play out the same narrative of the story of creation. So when the potter is creating pots, there is a backstory or a narrative that is being played out by means of this Purana, which is trying to explain the story of the overall creation of universe by trying to portray that whole creation story within the work of the potter. Now, very interestingly, this is not something that is very specific to a region. So again, that is something that as one continues to appeal through these layers of Jati Puranas, you'd also see that even though you may not have like the exact replicant of this particular Jati elsewhere, but you'd see that this particular arrangement is something that was prevalent elsewhere in the country as well. So specifically in the context of potters, there's a very good book written by Professor Baidyanath Saraswati. It's called Pottery Making Cultures and Indian Civilization, where he kind of gets into the details of all of these pottery cultures, and he refers to a lot of these cultures in Central and East India. So that's where you'd see that even there, let's say in Bihar, in Bengal, when you are looking at how these pottery making cultures saw themselves, you'd again see a very similar parallel play out, where when they are describing their own work and when they are sacralizing their own work, you have Prajapati come in, you have Vishnu come in, you have Shiva come in, and it's a very similar activity that happens there. So even in this Puranam for the Kumaris, again, you'd also see this narrative come in of the gods getting married. So for example, of Uma Maheshwara or Shiva Parvati Kalyanam happening. And then they need pots to conduct something during the marriage for their rituals. And again, there is a story that is woven there to say that right from those times, you needed people to perform these functions, and there is an origin myth for the potter caste, and then it kind of continues through for centuries. And each of these activities, let's say a Shiva Parvati Kalyanam that is happening, that gets played out in any other marriage that happens in the village or in the city, even now, for example, that each individual getting married is seen as a way in which the marriage of the gods is getting played out once again, and then that's where all these jatis get to participate again in that particular function. So moving on, if you take another jati as an example here, we have a jati which is called Jalaris in Telugu, which is the fisherman caste. They're also referred to by other names like Gangaputras, for example. So in this case of Gangaputras, as the name itself goes, they see themselves as the continuing or the progeny of Ganga, and for them Ganga Putra. So if those who are of you, a lot of us, of course, are, I mean, who are familiar with Mahabharata, they know the story of Bhishma. Where you have the story of Gangama and then Shantanu, and then the story of Bhishma being born and all of that that flows through. So this particular caste of Gangaputras and Jalaris, they consider themselves as somebody who is carrying forward the lineage of Bhishma. And others in that caste line also, like, there are many variants of these stories and Puranas. So there are people from these fisherman caste, for example, who also line up their lineage to the story of Matsya Gandhi. Again, for those of you familiar with Mahabharata, there is a story of Satyavati, Matsya Gandhi, and then the King Shantanu seeing Matsya Gandhi, and then them getting married, and then continuing with the lineage. That's how the whole Mahabharata as an epic poem actually starts to peg the whole story to a particular dynasty, and then from the dynasty it kind of flows through. So the Gangaputras and fishermen, given that their whole narrative, their whole work and life is attached to waters, and waters is attached to Ganga. So that's how that whole myth, if you want to use that word, that gets constructed, that their work gets sacralized here, because it is shown as something that they are just carrying forward the work of the founding fathers of Indian civilization. Now, similarly, if you take another Jati, there's a Jati called Vaddarlu or Oddera. This is a Jati, again, you can find in similar sounding names, which is prevalent in other states in the country as well. They're called Odras, Ods, so on. So this particular Jati, a caste cluster, if you want to use that word, there are Odderas, there are also people who are called Upparas, who perform the role of salt making. They operate in seashores, and they kind of make salt. So these Jatis, they all rally around the story of Sagara. So Sagara Kumaras is again a story which is very popular in Puranas and Ramayana as well, where there is a king Sagara, and then there are thousands of sons of his who go around the earth digging, because they are looking for a horse, which is a part of the Ashwamedha ritual. And in the process of digging the earth, they have an encounter with sage Kapila, who is an incarnation of Vishnu, and these people, then they get burnt into ashes, and then later the next in line lineage of King Sagara, you have the story of Bhagirath coming in, where Bhagirath then prays, and then the Ganga comes to the earth, and then through that process, these Sagara Kumaras who are burnt to ashes, they kind of attain the next stage in their life, or they attain moksha, so on. So the very interesting aspect that happens here is Odderas as a Jati, they are involved in constructing ponds, in stone cutting, in digging, that kind of a work. So this activity of digging and digging for ponds, digging for construction, that ties back in their origin myths through the activity of digging that was done by Sagar Kumaras, and through the process where the Sakara Kumaras went about searching for a horse. They kept digging all out in the earth. So these particular Jati of Odderas, they tie themselves back to the Sagara Kshatriyas, and they worship or they idolize Bhagirath as well in that process. So it is very interesting on how no aspect of Indian epics and Puranas are left untouched. That in the Ashtadasha Puranas, or the let's say the Shishta or the Brahminical version, so called, when you look at this, we probably put more emphasis on Bhagirath's tapas and getting Ganga back onto the earth. But here there is a Jati which is putting emphasis on the work done by the Sagara Kumaras and that part of the myth, because they are saying that the digging and construction activity that they have done, they are pegging it back to that particular episode of Sagar Kumaras. So the Hindu pantheon of epics and Puranas, they kind of tie back to each of these individual Jatis, and it is this way that this kind of work is getting sacralized, and that is something very unique to how the Hinduism as a religion operated compared to, let's say, any other Abrahamic faiths. You wouldn't find this kind of a parallel elsewhere. You may find it in, let's say, in pagan cultures in pre-Christian Europe, but you would not see it in, let's say, in any other mainstream religions. It is very interesting that Hinduism over the years and over centuries continue to nurture all of this. There was no attempt to, let's say, annihilate any of these traditions, to say that no, you should only follow the Astadasha Puranas, you should only follow this, and this is the only sacrosanct truth. Nothing of that sort ever happened. All of these Jatis continue to thrive and survive, and they all had their own narratives that were at play. Now,
Kalyanji, I think you are concluding now.
Sure. Yep.
Yeah.
So there were hundreds of such Jatis, and each of these Jatis had these stories across regions. So you'd find these stories in Gujarat, in Rajasthan, in Uttarakhand, in Orissa, so on, in Bengal. So there's work to be done in terms of crystallizing these stories of Jati Puranas, in terms of mainstreaming them, in terms of popularizing them, and so that everybody gets a more nuanced understanding of Jatis, and we don't look at our own Jatis and our own own culture from a Marxist lens, and we kind of apply a dharmic lens to understand how these Jaatis and Jati Puranas grew organically and how they saw themselves fit into a master narrative or a master picture, and understanding the self-image of each of these Jaatis to quote Dharampalji, as I mentioned at the earlier part of the talk. It is of a great importance to understand the self-image of these Jaatis, and the Jati Puranas have a great role to play there in understanding this particular self-image of these Jaatis. And I understand, I mean, we are living in a different world and a lot of these things are getting challenged. But if we are to understand who we are, what is our culture and what is our cultural past, Jati Puranas are absolutely critical in that exercise. Thanks to Indica Academy and Team Indica for giving me this opportunity.
Thanks, Kalyanji. Excellent presentation with very good analysis, very important points touched, and a wide range of data, wide range of occupations, and wide range of jatis and their upajatis and their narratives covered in your discussion. That lays a very good foundation even for my talk that I am going to give after Sri Chaitra. Thank you very much.